Hello and welcome to this talk about optimizing your web front-end performance. How to measure web performance is a broad and gnarly topic, and over the years, whilst we've been cracking at it at Trainline, we've scored some wins, but also made a number of mistakes, many of which are common, even considered best practices in the industry, and which I'll share with you towards the end of the talk. My name is Carl Anderson. I'm the Director of Engineering for Frontends at Trainline. So that means that I'm responsible for our applications, iOS and Android, on our websites, APIs, and pretty much everything that externally facing at Trainline. For those of you that don't know the Trainline, Trainline's mission is to empower people to make greener travel choices, i.e. hopping in trains rather than taking the car or the plane. And to do that, we're building the world's #1 rail platform, which basically takes form in a website and applications to which we've connected to over 270 rail and coach carriers. So that's in the UK, but also all across Europe, serving 45 countries. We got roughly 30,000 stations that we're serving. And to give you an idea of scale, pre-COVID, we have a roughly 90 million visits per month, and our apps were downloaded over 30 million times. So that's what we do, and that's for context. So I think the first one, just a quick few slides for context, is why speed matters. And I think it obviously matters because it's good karma as a developer. I think none of us wake up in the morning thinking, hey, I'm going to do a slow website, right? We all, as developers, we're all striving for performance. We're all striving to create some slick, nice UIs and UX for users. But beyond that, from an operational standpoint, we all know that the internet consumes a lot of energy, and actually today, powering the internet consumes more than the energy consumed by the UK. And this electricity consumption actually has an enormous carbon footprint because all that electricity is not entirely green. So the less energy we consume, the faster our product is, the less time users use it, and the faster our server actually serve back the results to it, the lesser our footprint. That's good karma. But if we take a step back, and this ties back to our mission at Trainline, transportation is the 4th emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. And if you look at that category, half of it is cars, 10% is airplanes, and trains is actually the greenest means of transportation in the world right now, in the accounts at less than 1%. So the more we can get people to forget about air travel or their car and actually commute by train, the better it is for the planet. And we can do that at Trainline by just providing a really smooth, really slick user experience that just makes using trains as easy as hopping in your car. That's what we're aiming for. But that's not just good karma to create fast and slick website. What's great is that it's also aligned with your business goals. I think one of the first things that we did when we started working actively on performance a couple of years ago is we started looking at different metrics. One of them was the time to first byte, and that's what you're seeing in the graph right there. If you see the green line in the trend, it's indexed on the time that it takes, and the spike of the best step conversion on that page is roughly around 200 milliseconds. And as your time to first byte it gets longer to get your data across the wire, actually your step conversion drastically reduces, and actually it gets divided by 2, because here at the beginning the step conversion is at 40%, but if your time to first byte is around 2 seconds, you're now down to 20%. So people just don't convert, just go back because your website is too slow. You get the same idea here with another performance metric named the cumulative layout shift, CLS, which is basically the amount of change in your page. Is the score, the amount of change in your page where, as things load, the layout changes and things move, which can be quite annoying as a user when we've all been faced with those moments where you're trying to click on something and that thing changes or moves, and then you end up clicking on something else, which is quite annoying. So that's what the cumulative layout shift score measure. And same with that one. So it starts at roughly 6% step conversion, but as the cumulative layout score increases, which means that more things are moving on the page, you can see the step conversion drastically reducing as well. So creating fast and great page experience in your product is just good for your business as well. And very recently, because actually this is happening right now, there's the Web Vitals introduced by Google, which is a Google initiative. I think it was introduced probably last year, but I think the difference is that this year, what they call the core Web Vitals is now becoming a ranking factor in the Google search. So that if a two websites that provide the same relevance of information, one has a better page experience than the other one, is going to have a higher ranking in the Google search algorithm. So this is actually an opportunity for those that have fast websites to actually gain and page ranking. So it's even more important more than ever. And this is actually rolling out right now in May 2021. Okay, so I think we all bought into the fact that we want to create fast websites. I think the first thing to get started with is that you need to measure. There's a famous saying, I think it's Peter Drucker, the management consultant, said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And actually, you could even go further. It's like, whatever you measure, you improve, or we optimize what we measure is really the idea behind it. So the first thing is to build a baseline. But building a baseline is super hard with web performance because there's not a single speed metric. It's a mix of lots of different signals, lots of different metrics that you got to go. And I think if you're starting on this journey, the best way to get started is obviously the Google Core Web Vitals, because they're so important in your ranking algorithm at the minute, or it's becoming increasingly important. It already was. But basically, the way Google structured it is, it's measuring the page experience, and it's a balancing act in between three pillars: loading, so how fast you're loading your content, interactivity, and then visual stability. Because if you only take one of these, right, if you optimize for the load time, well, you can go super fast to actually show content, but then it might not be interactive. Because this is where the first input delay comes in, is they're going to measure when you tap or click on an item. And if your CPU is still running and still processing other things, it's not idle yet, it cannot take your interaction into account. So this feels very annoying as a customer, right? You tap on the thing and it doesn't take that into account. So, and then the opposite, if you go for interactivity, where you want to build everything and make sure that everything is ready before you actually paint anything on the screen, well, you end up having your customers just staring at a blank page for seconds, which is just not a great experience. So you need to find the right balance. And same with visual stability. Is in between the two. You got the interactivity ready, you load all the content, but if you keep moving things as the content pops in the page, because it's all asynchronous, each and every individual component is actually interactive, but they pop up and they move stuff. Well, it's hard for the user to actually start interacting with your page as it builds, which then becomes really annoying. So building a baseline with the Google Core Web Vitals is a great start to drive your page experience. The next step, I think, is you shouldn't just stop there. They're great to start, but they can be, there are lots of other metrics that you can use to drive performance and great performance within your web application. So an example that we'd already talked about was the time to first byte a bit earlier, is the first byte that you send over the wire. You want that to be as fast as possible. And if you look at that curve, you can see that the sweet spot seems to be around 200 milliseconds. So you want to shift that that if you look at the histogram, you want to shift that curve to that sweet spot of 200 milliseconds here. Same with the first contentful pane. So that's the first thing that a user sees. So going from a blank screen to something, you want that something to be meaningful, first of all. And then same, you want to get it where your step conversion is on that example. So you want to shift it all to the left. So measuring is the first key thing. But then I think what's also very interesting with what we've just talked about and with those graphs is that it doesn't just measure performance and pure tech performance, it actually links it to business metrics. So you can see the impact. So I think really the key thing, what we started on our journey was really about measuring all the things that we can measure. Let's link them to different business metrics, such as the conversion rate, such as the bounce rate, and then just they see, is there any correlation? And let's find the right tech metrics that have a direct business impact, because those are the ones you want to go after. I think another quick tip that we've learned from going under that journey and starting doing that is there's lots of different tools to actually measure your performance, but they don't all have the same definition of the same metric, or they measure it slightly differently. So really, I think compare apples with apples is really just try to use the same tool with everything, so you can have that overlay of your business metric and your tech metrics, and then it's all comparable in between the different graphs that you have, because it all uses the same way of measuring a specific metric. And I think also what's very important is record as much as possible, metrics, waterfalls, and do that continuously over time so that you can see the trend. And I think a key thing that we had at Trainline when we started this is we're starting as well on those graphs. We started to set markers when we were doing each time we were doing a release. So you would see the graph, you would see the release, and you could see the curve then either go up or down. So you'd see the impact of what you just released. And so that was very insightful in our team, because then we would build our hypothesis and we'd go like, okay, let's see what impact it will have. So that was also very, very interesting. So this allowed us to find. So we started with our own metrics, and the Google Core Web Vitals came in. So that was quite interesting. But still, as we started going into optimizing for it, we actually realized that there's still some gaps, because those metrics are generic and standard. Google needs a standard way to measure the performance of websites from various companies. But no one else but us knows better than how our product works. And I think this is kind of what we started doing, is that if you can see on the left, there's quite a gap. That's the waterfall of a web page loading. There's quite a gap in between the early metrics and then the later metrics that you get when a web page gets constructed. So what we started doing is we started increasing granularity with our own metrics as to the time to boot our React.js application, the time for the single page application to be loaded, and time to iteration, and all those kind of metrics. That was quite interesting, because there are all those times where, as an engineer, you can actually input and to try various things to have an impact on those. And then I'll talk a little bit in the next slide of that home ready metrics. That was also a key finding for us. Was, again, as I was saying, is nobody knows your product as well as you do. And so to measure your page experience the best that you can, what we soon started to do is identify with our product teams what's the key action of that page, and then the tech teams, what we started doing is measuring when that action actually was ready. And by ready, I mean when it's ready to interact with. So it's painted, the JS events are there, just ready for the user to consume it. And so that was a critical one, because then it gave us the actual moment when when the page is just ready to go, and it is what the user expects in there. And so this created the graph that you're seeing here, is that then we have that flow, in the booking flow, where we go from loading the application, like a hard navigation, going when we load the single page application, all the way to when the home is ready, which basically means that the search widget is interactable. It can still mean that we're still loading asynchronously in the background extra things, but at least you can now search from London to Cambridge, for instance. And then you type in your stuff, you hit search, you arrive on the search results page, and then that next marker is when all the results are actually displayed on the screen and ready to interact. And that's the next marker. And then we're going to measure from that moment you click search to that moment that those are ready. That's an extra wait time, and we're going to do that for every step of your flow. So at the end, it allows us to build that graph that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen, which is the total wait time that a user sees or experiences as they're going for a flow. And obviously, our goal is to make that as small as possible. It also actually highlights the fact that performance is a very cumulative sport, right? It's not just front end inside, it's not just back end. You want to have that entire stack to be, to be as fast as possible. So at that stage, you've got a set of metrics that you're monitoring to measure performance. We talked about Google Web Vitals. We talked about other technical ones that are interesting to you, such as time to first byte or first contentful paint. We've also talked about your own custom metrics to measure really the moment where a user can actually interact with the web page. But now there's how do you monitor those? And there's always that debate, or shall we go synthetics? Shall we go real user monitoring, RUM? Do we need both? And yeah, the answer is definitely both, because both serve a very specific purpose. Synthetics is lab data. So it's the one where you got the waterfalls, you've got all your profiler information. It's a controlled test environment, so it's very consistent. So you can run the same tests over and over and over again. So you're really testing your actual code in a controlled environment. And so you can see a trend, you can see progression through the updates that you're doing in your code. And really, user monitoring is the key one, because that's still data. That's what users really experience. So that's the end goal. The end goal is to improve and to create the best experience possible for these users. So those are great to use as KPIs. And then what you're doing is that you're using synthetics to test your hypothesis, to build a backlog. Then you ship those, and then you monitor in production. See, did it have the impact that I thought it was going to be? So really, you need a combination of both. And so now you have all these metrics. You're measuring in synthetics. You're measuring in production. That's a lot of data. So how do you look at that data? And I think to that, the first trap: don't use averages ever, because it just paints a crooked picture of the world. If you divide, if you compute an average, it will paint a picture of a world where all your requests run at the same speed, and that's obviously not true. I think one mistake that we've made at the very beginning when we went onto that, when we started that journey of optimizing our web performance, we started at the 95th percentile to scrape off oddities or the outliers at the very end of the scope where they have network issues or connectivity issues. So it's like, let's just drop the 5 last percent, but then let's just focus on that value which 95% of our customers are actually experiencing or below. So that actually was a mistake retrospectively, because when you're doing something if you look at the median where most of our users are, and you have like a significant performance improvement here, often what we realize, or actually our degradation, that's the example on the left, on the right, our degradation, often you would actually see anything in the 90th percentile because the value is so high compared to where the bulk of your users are. We actually found out that it was better to have two separate buckets and always look at your median. That's where most of your customers, that's what most of your customers are experiencing, and really monitor that space, and then have separate one for the 90th percentile, because usually the 90th percentile is like so high, so slow compared to the median, that if you lose 1 second out of a 10-second wait, you sure you've got to look into it, but that's not the top priority. Whereas if you're losing, as the example on the slide, 100 milliseconds for half of your customers, for the bulk of your requests, then you definitely should hop onto that one and identify what was going on in there. So having a mix of the 50th and the 90th percentiles definitely was a big win for us to help us improve our performance. So I'm thinking now what we could do is talk about key learnings that we got on top of all the stuff, because right now you're in a world where you're monitoring all those metrics, you get the right signals and not the noise. But then how do you optimize? I think one of the first mistakes what we've done at Trainline is, before we had the ready metrics, there's a metric named time to interactive, which just sounds like the ready metric, right? That moment where the website is interactive for your users. And that sounds great, but actually in practice, that metric doesn't really work. It's overly, I mean, it does work, but doesn't work for optimization work, because it doesn't paint what the user actually experiences. And that's due to the fact of how it's calculated, and you've got the definition on the right. Actually, that I like the original name of that metric, which was the time to consistently interactives, which is basically that moment where your website is interactive and nothing else happens. Like literally, it's idle. The trick with the TTI is that if ever there's an asynchronous operation happening in the background, well, it's still running, even though you don't really care, because your search widget is already there, loaded, and the customer is already able to interact with. So it doesn't really matter, actually. So this is how we went to dropping that metric and actually going and focusing more into the page ready metrics. Another key learning that we've got from that journey was to not aim for 100% Lighthouse score. As a developer, that one is very tempting. You got that great lab tool that tells you like, oh, you got to do this, that, and then you're going to be perfect from a performance perspective. But actually, so yes, it's very interesting. It's all lab data in Lighthouse, so that might not be what your user experienced. And actually, you might have in production some other pitfalls or some other things that you can optimize that are actually of a higher value than going for the one in Lighthouse. So in terms of prioritization, that's not the best one as well. And then also it's lab data. So you're really focusing on the first experience, because in the world, if you have a lot of repeated customers, for instance, that just come back to your website, they have a lot of things already cached in their browser. So it might not be as bad as Lighthouse paints. Another mistake we've done and we learned from was focusing on the size of our uncompressed JavaScript. Actually, when we looked at it at first, it was like, actually, we have this big load time. And obviously, in the web, users have to then load the code before actually be able to use the web application. So it sounded like a great idea to actually look at the uncompressed JavaScript size, and then try to swap, all those dependencies for lighter weight ones, right? And then just reduce that uncompressed size. So we've gone through that work, we've done that. And then when we released it to production, we were like so disappointed because in practice, the compressions, it's just, plus the user CDN is just so great that it didn't really matter. And it really didn't, I mean, there was a small improvement. I don't really actually remember the number of milliseconds we gained out of it, but it was like super small. And that wasn't the best one. What we did get out of this though, is that measuring the size does matter, and actually that worked great as a guardrail. And having in your pipeline some automatic guardrails that looks at the size of your bundles to ensure that no one commits or merges a pull request that suddenly raises drastically the size of your JS is actually a good idea. And when we set this up, we actually caught some mistakes that where a developer in the team would have significantly grown the size of a web application with it without doing it knowingly. So that was actually a good takeaway and a good learning. And then I think globally, just obviously in this talk, we really focused on like the good practice and how you set up your monitoring so that you pick up the signal and focus on the experience. But out of this, you're going to pick up a lot of stuff. And all these are actually fairly no-brainers. It's just in between, all this feature development. And I think there's not a one. I guess what I want to say and what I was trying to convey in this talk is rather than giving one-size-fits-all solutions, I said just set the right monitoring and then you'll find those out yourself. But then there's just the obvious stuff, as always, that performance is cumulative, so it's pointless to have a great, fast, slick website if you have a very slow backend. That's what you want to tackle. If you can skip entire steps of the flow to optimize for specific users that have, I don't know, some details or travel options already saved with their profile, you should definitely do so. And this is where you're going to shave off more wait time for your users rather than just go full technical. Size does matter. So that we talked just about. So look at all your assets. Don't really don't load what you don't need to. I'm thinking all those third-party dependencies. Just like lazy loading is always a good thing. And then when you load something, you really only load what you use. So if you can like split your bundle so you don't have to load the entire application on your first page because most of the users are actually not going to use the rest of the application, it's always a win. And your best practices, so I've just put a few in there like connection pooling, caching. And when I talk about caching, it's everything from at the platform level or within the data level. It optimizes the payloads, like all this basic obvious stuff. Definitely do so, but having the right monitoring is going to make sure that you keep the attention to all those little details that actually do matter in the end. And then another one that was actually quite interesting is by setting this monitoring, sometimes in between releases, we would get the spikes or like this performance degradation, and we didn't understand where it was coming from. And it was, an advertising campaign, or it was the marketing team that introduced yet another tracking pixel with a synchronous external dependency on another server. So watch out for those. Definitely look at it, have a process so that you're working jointly with the marketing team to make sure that those don't happen. Because again, if you shave off like a second out of there and then they introduce a new tracking pixel that just wipes it off, it's just such a bummer. So I guess really if there's one key thing to take away from this talk, it's just don't focus on a single metric. A single speed metric does not exist. What we should be focusing on is really the user experience. And to do that, you're gonna need multiple metrics to find the right balance in between the load time, interactivity, layout shifts, but also making sure that the key actions of each and every of your page becomes interactive as fast as possible. So that's it for this talk. what we've seen and talked about in here was about creating fast websites, actually good karma for devs, users, and the planet. So you should definitely spend some time having the right monitoring and right focus to make it happen. Page experience is becoming a ranking factor in Google search, so it's important to you, and it actually creates new opportunities for us. Start measuring your website performance, because we optimize what we measure. There isn't a single speed metric. Find yours, and it's about finding balance, as we talked about. And then I think the key one really, collect data continuously and link it to releases to be able to compare and iterate over your performance backlog. But really the gist of it is focusing on the user experience, and the way we did it and what worked best for us really was with the ready metrics. And then in terms of how you monitor them, you need both synthetics and real user monitoring with a mix of 50th and 90th percentile is what worked best for Trainline. So thank you very much for your time. Have a great conference, and talk to you. See you soon.
That was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much indeed. I have to admit there are lots of mistakes in there that I've made, talking around Lighthouse scores and time to interactive and so on. Since you didn't have time to go into it during the talk itself, can you give us a sort of high-level overview of what Trainline's architecture looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a microservice architecture. We have about 350, 400 services in the background. Those can be of multiple languages, either .NET or Ruby, mostly, some Node.js as well. And then on top of that, we got various front ends consuming either .NET APIs that serve as an orchestration layer, or Node.js API doing the same work. Then for React.js single page applications, or mobile applications.
And would you expect the method you were describing to optimize web performance, would you expect that to work with any architecture?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Here, what we talked about really was how, I think it's a recipe to measure performance in a front-end application, which is very different from a back-end application where you can just look at the transaction time, the request time, the time for the request that comes in and out of the box. Whereas here in the front end, there are numerous signals, and we talked about it in the talk, right? You don't just optimize for the load time. Having a fast and nice web experience is much more than that.
And you mentioned you were using Lighthouse, but obviously not to kind of optimize for 100% Lighthouse score. Is there other tooling that you're using specifically around optimizing for the core Web Vitals ranking change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key tool that we're using is speed curve. You know, the first graph that you've seen in the talk, the one with the black background and orange, those are a speed curve that we're using. And what's great about speed curve is that it provides synthetics checks as well as lux, and has very nice waterfalls. It has very nice. You can actually see. You can compare between two deployments, two versions of your website with the waterfall, and you can get videos of how fast they load and compare side by side. So that's actually quite nice. I really like that one. And then the other website, I think the other graphs that you've seen in the talk were actually just came out from New Relic. So it's us having our own metrics and raising that through New Relic events, so that we can create those wait time graphs that we had. So it's a mix of standard tooling and in-house.
Right. Yes. Cool. Thank you. There's a question that came up 2 or 3 times in slightly different ways through the chat, which was to do with basically overhead of monitoring. So I'll read this one here, which says, could adding that much monitoring lead to performance issues in itself? Oh
yeah, that's a good one. I think, so no, not, I think the first one is in the monitoring, you're gonna add probably a JavaScript script that is gonna provide you with those monitoring tools. So we talked about speed curve. In real user monitoring, if you wanna do that, you're gonna have to download that JavaScript. The speed curve one is actually very lightweight, very small, so it's not gonna impact you so much. But yeah, be careful about that. If you create your own, or if you're using a tool from a third party, just check how big that JavaScript is, because that adds weight to the page and weight to your application, so it could add to your load time. But then there's several ways to do it. You could, if you think it's not primordial, you can actually load it asynchronously in the background a bit later, if that's okay with you. It kind of depends on what you have on your web page, but it's also a possibility. So yes, it could impact your performance if it's really big, but honestly, it's a good investment, because without that, you're blind. So yeah, pick a tool that's lightweight, and then definitely add it.
There's a question here to do with caching. So when you talk about caching as a good practice, what kind of caching are you referring to?
Yeah, here I was talking about caching generally. I think the thing with caching, the challenge with caching is always the same thing: is when do you invalidate your cache? So you got to be always super careful with that one. But I think there's several. It's at all layers basically. You got platform caching where you cache it in on your CDN, so it doesn't go straight to the server. So you improve your time to first byte. It's also caching of data within your application, whenever you can spare yourself a round trip to the backend is always a good thing. Again, be careful with the invalidation, because definitely, I mean, our users expect to have like a real time and the correct price on the ticket. So they click on something and then turn out that it's 20 quid more expensive later on. It's not going to be a good experience. So you got to be careful of those. You cannot cache all the data, but the more you do and the more round trips you spare your users, the better it is for sure. And it's the same for assets and like pretty much everything.
It's something of a sort of speculative question in a way, but do you have a sense of how much impact you think Core Web Vitals will have in terms of a ranking factor? I remember the SSL one, which I have sites that are still not running on SSL, and to be honest, I can't measure the difference. So I'm curious to know what you think of this one. Do you think it will actually have a significant impact? It's speculation, but
so hard to say. I don't work at Google, right? But so I think the answer is I don't know yet. What is pretty clear is that they are going to be rolling it out. I think it got postponed a little bit in June now, and the rollout is going to be gradual. So I guess we're going to see. My thinking is that it's just such. I mean, it's so impactful that they're going to take it slowly, and they're probably going to start ramping up on English languages first, and then Europe usually comes a few weeks after. It's usually 2 to 3 weeks behind. So I think over the summer, we're going to start seeing how impactful it is. But I think it's fair to say that I think the example that you took with HTTPS is probably a right one in the beginning, and then we'll see, because it's just one indicator out of many others, right? Relevancy is still going to be the top main thing that you expect as a ranking factor.
Right. Yes. Okay. That's brilliant, Carl. Thank you so much. We are just about at time. So I think what I'm going to do there is I'm going to wrap up the session in this room. There is a Zoom room which you can find on the schedule. I think there are links to it here. Carl, are you able to pop along to the Zoom room for the kind of
absolutely. I'll be there if you want to have a chat, because there's a lot more questions on the right.
There's lots more questions we didn't get to.
I'd be happy to talk about.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you very much indeed. Fantastic talk. Really appreciate it. I'll see you in Zoom in a minute or two.